June 4, 1942. 430 hours. USS Enterprise, 200 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky gripped the control stick of his Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber as the deck crew signaled for engine start. The pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific wrapped around the carrier like a black shroud, broken only by the dim blue lights marking the flight deck edges. His fuel gauge would show full tanks once the engine caught, enough for perhaps 4 hours of flight time if he managed it carefully, less if he had to search for the Japanese fleet. Around him on the crowded deck, 32 more Dauntless bombers were preparing to launch into what naval intelligence officers had briefed as potentially the most decisive carrier battle of the Pacific War. McClusky had been flying combat missions since December 7th, when he'd watched from Enterprise's returning aircraft as Pearl Harbor burned below him. 6 months of war had taught him the harsh mathematics of carrier combat. American dive bombers attacking Japanese task forces defended by Mitsubishi. As 6 M0 fighters suffered losses that would be unsustainable in a long campaign. The Zero could outmaneuver any American aircraft in the Pacific inventory. It climbed faster, turned inside any radius an American plane could manage, and stayed in the air longer. Its pilots, many with years of combat experience from the war in China, had developed tactics that maximized these advantages. The statistics from Coral Sea 1 month earlier painted a grim picture. Lexington's dive bomber squadron had lost nearly a third of its aircraft. The torpedo bombers had fared even worse. The Zero fighters seemed to appear from nowhere, slashing through American formations before gunners could even traverse their weapons. As McClusky ran through his pre-flight checklist, he knew that conventional doctrine, maintaining tight defensive formations, coordinating attacks, following predetermined attack patterns, had proven costly against Japanese defensive tactics. As his Dauntless rolled forward toward the launch position, its right cyclone engine warming to operating temperature, McClusky had no idea that within 6 hours, American dive bombers would deliver the most decisive blow in naval aviation history. 3 Japanese carriers would be burning wrecks, with a 4th to follow. The transformation wouldn't come from new technology or brilliant tactical planning, but from a series of navigation errors, communication failures, and desperate decisions that would accidentally expose a vulnerability in Japanese defensive doctrine. The Japanese Navy had developed its carrier defense tactics through years of training and refinement. The combat air patrol system centered on the Zero's superiority, with fighters stationed at different altitudes to intercept attacking aircraft in coordinated waves. Fighter directors on each carrier vectored Zeros toward incoming threats, ensuring multiple fighters converged on each attack group. The system had worked flawlessly at Pearl Harbor, devastatingly at the Indian Ocean raids, and effectively at Coral Sea. Standing on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo commanded the most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried 248 aircraft, manned by the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. Many of his Zero pilots had over 500 hours of combat flying. His dive bomber and torpedo bomber crews had executed attacks from Ceylon to Darwin without a single carrier lost. But the American attack on June 4th would violate every assumption of organized warfare, not by design, but by accident and necessity. It would begin before dawn with strikes from Midway Island itself, continue with carrier aircraft arriving piecemeal from different directions due to navigation disagreements and fuel concerns, and culminate in dive bombers appearing simultaneously from multiple angles purely by circumstance. The first disruption came from Midway itself. At 0430, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimmies was briefing his pilots on Eastern Island. Marine Aircraft Group 22 had a collection of aircraft that ranged from obsolete to barely adequate. Ancient Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters, Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers, so old pilots called them vibrators, and a handful of new Douglas SBD Dauntlesses. Also present were 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, so new that this would be their combat debut, and 4 Army Air Force's B-26 Marauder bombers hastily modified to carry torpedoes. At 0545, radar on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike, 108, aircraft commanded by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. Every operational aircraft on Midway launched immediately. The Marine fighters met Tomonaga's strike force 30 miles from Midway. 25 F-2A Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats engaged 36 Zero fighters escorting the bombers. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were shot down, with 7 more badly damaged. But their sacrifice had forced the Japanese strike to break formation, disrupting the carefully planned attack sequence. While Midway burned under Japanese bombs, the first American strike aircraft to find the Japanese fleet were 6 TBF Avengers, led by Lieutenant Langdon Feebling. These aircraft were actually a detachment from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 that had been left at Pearl Harbor to transition to the new aircraft, then sent ahead to Midway. At 0710, Feebling spotted the Japanese carriers and immediately attacked, despite having no fighter escort and facing at least 30 Zeros. The Zeros swarmed the torpedo bombers. Ensign Albert Ernest, piloting the 2nd TBF, watched Feebling's aircraft explode in front of him. His own plane was immediately hit by cannon fire that killed his turret gunner. More shells tore through the aircraft, wounding radio man Harry Ferrier and severing control cables. Ernest pressed his attack, dropping his torpedo at the carrier Hiryu before wrestling his crippled aircraft back toward Midway. 5 of 6 TBFs were shot down. Only Ernest's aircraft made it back, crash landing with over 70 holes in the fuselage. 4 B-26 Marauders attacked minutes later. Lieutenant James Murray's B-26 flew directly down Akagi's flight deck at bridge height, his gunners strafing the deck. 1 B-26, on fire and out of control, nearly struck Akagi's bridge before crashing into the sea. These attacks forced the Japanese to react, launch fighters, and maneuver their ships, disrupting carrier operations. Meanwhile, the American carriers were launching their strikes, but coordination immediately failed. Enterprise and Hornet were supposed to launch simultaneously, but delays on Hornet meant Enterprise's aircraft departed first. Yorktown, operating independently, launched an hour later. Each air group flew different courses based on different assumptions about Japanese movements. The breakdown worsened after launch. Commander Stanhope Ring, leading Hornet's air group, flew a course that took his dive bombers and fighters away from the Japanese fleet entirely. They would never find the enemy. But Torpedo Squadron 8's commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, disagreed with Ring's navigation. A Lakota Sioux from South Dakota with 15 years of flying experience, Waldron had developed exceptional navigation skills. When Ring refused to change course, Waldron made a fateful decision. He broke formation, leading his 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers away from the rest of Hornet's air group. Before launch, he had told his squadron, "If we run out of gas, if we get shot to pieces, if there's only one plane left, I want that man to get a hit." At 9:20, Waldron's navigation proved correct. The Japanese carriers appeared exactly where he had predicted. But Torpedo Squadron 8 was alone. No fighters, no dive bombers, just 15 obsolete torpedo bombers. The Zeros descended on them immediately. Waldron's plane was hit first, exploding in flames. One by one, the torpedo bombers fell. Ensign George Gay, flying the last plane, watched his squadron mates die before his own aircraft was shot down. He was the sole survivor of 30 pilots and crew, floating in the water among the Japanese fleet. 20 minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 TBDS toward the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. The escorting Wildcats had become separated. 10 aircraft were shot down, including Lindsay's. No torpedoes hit. At 0940, Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron attacked. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's 12 TBDS had minimal fighter escort that proved ineffective. 10 were shot down. Massey died when his aircraft exploded. By 10:15, 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked. 35 had been shot down. Not a single torpedo had hit. But crucially, the repeated attacks from different directions had pulled every Zero down to sea level and forced the carriers to maneuver constantly, disrupting their preparations to strike the American fleet. High above, American dive bombers searched for the Japanese fleet. McClusky's 2 squadrons from Enterprise had flown southwest, found empty ocean, and faced a critical fuel decision. At 09:55, he spotted the destroyer Arashi racing northeast. It was returning after attacking the submarine USS Nautilus. McClusky decided to follow it. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, flew behind McClusky. A 1932 Annapolis graduate, Best was one of the Navy's most experienced dive bomber pilots. He had been flying SBDS since 1940 and had developed strong opinions about attack tactics, emphasizing accuracy over formation discipline. At 10:20, McClusky's squadrons found the Japanese carriers. Below them, 4 carriers maneuvered independently, their formation broken by the morning's attacks. The Zeros were all at low altitude, still pursuing torpedo bombers. The carriers' flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. McClusky ordered immediate attack. There was no time to coordinate properly with fuel running low. Both squadrons dove on the nearest carrier, Kaga. But Best, seeing everyone going for the same target, pulled out with his 2 wingmen and headed for Akagi instead. This wasn't a pre-planned tactic, but a split-second decision to avoid wasting bombs on one target. Best's bomb punched through Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar among fueled aircraft. His wingmen scored near misses. Within minutes, Akagi was ablaze. Admiral Nagumo had to be physically removed from the bridge. Simultaneously, multiple bombs struck Kaga. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher scored the first hit. Captain Jisaku Okada died when a bomb hit the bridge. Kaga became an inferno. As Enterprise's bombers pulled out, 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown appeared. Bombing Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. They dove on Soryu, scoring 3 hits that started uncontrollable fires. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. The 4th, Hiryu, hidden by a rain squall, had temporarily escaped. The scattered arrivals and attacks from multiple directions had prevented the Zeros from mounting an effective defense, though this was more accident than design. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, aboard Akagi when the bombs struck, later wrote in his memoir, "The Americans' approach seemed uncoordinated, with bombers arriving from different directions. This made it difficult for our fighters to respond effectively. This was an observation, not a recognition of deliberate tactics." Hiryu launched 2 strikes that afternoon, damaging Yorktown severely. But when American dive bombers found Hiryu, they attacked in scattered groups due to fuel limitations and aircraft availability. 4 bombs sealed her fate. The Battle of Midway's success came from multiple factors beyond the scattered attacks. American codebreakers had revealed Japanese plans, allowing carriers to be positioned for ambush. The Japanese were caught in the midst of rearming operations, with ordnance exposed on deck. Admiral Nagumo's indecision about whether to attack Midway again or strike the American carriers created fatal delays. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons while failing to score hits had disrupted Japanese operations at the critical moment. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, who attacked Kaga, later wrote, "Our attack wasn't coordinated the way we'd practiced. Different squadrons arrived at different times from different angles. But it worked, maybe because the Japs weren't ready for that kind of scattered approach." The Navy's after-action analysis noted that the dispersed attacks had complicated Japanese defense, but didn't portray this as a revolutionary discovery. The report emphasized that success came from aggressive execution despite disorganization, not because of it. Post-war Japanese accounts confirm that the multiple directions of attack created defensive challenges. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, wrote, "The American attacks came piecemeal, which initially seemed advantageous to us. But the continuous nature of these attacks prevented us from launching our own strike. The influence on subsequent American tactics was evolutionary, not revolutionary. Training began emphasizing flexibility alongside formation discipline. Pilots were given more latitude for individual decision-making when situations demanded it. But this wasn't a wholesale abandonment of coordinated tactics. It was recognition that rigid doctrine could be a liability. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, American tactics had evolved to include deliberate flexibility. Strike packages still coordinated when possible, but were prepared to attack independently if separated. This adaptability, combined with improved aircraft, pilot training, and radar-directed fighter defense, produced the Marianas turkey shoot. Lieutenant Vernon Michel, who flew at Philippine Sea, recalled, "We'd learned from Midway that sometimes scattered attacks work better than perfect coordination, but it wasn't doctrine, it was just another tool in the toolbox." The legacy of Midway extends beyond tactical evolution. It demonstrated the importance of intelligence, the value of aggressive action even when imperfectly executed, and the role of fortune in battle. The scattered attacks that helped ensure victory weren't planned. They were the product of navigation disputes, communication failures, and desperate fuel situations. But they worked. Admiral Chester Nimitz later said, "McClusky's decision to continue searching and his judgment decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway." He didn't attribute victory to revolutionary tactics, but to determination and good decisions under pressure. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best never flew combat again after Midway. His malfunctioning oxygen system had caused him to breathe caustic soda, activating tuberculosis. He spent 2 years in naval hospitals before medical retirement. Reflecting on the battle years later, he said, "We hit them when they were vulnerable. The fact that we came in scattered all over the place probably helped, but the main thing was we caught them at the right moment." Ensign George Gay, observing from the water, had a unique perspective. The dive bombers came from different directions because that's where they were, not because it was planned that way. But it sure made it hard for the Zeros to stop them all. The transformation in carrier warfare after Midway wasn't about discovering that disorder defeats order. It was about recognizing that flexibility and adaptability matter more than rigid adherence to doctrine. American naval aviation learned to balance coordination with initiative, formation discipline with tactical flexibility. Modern military doctrine does emphasize distributed operations and unpredictability, but these concepts evolved gradually from many battles, not from a single revelation at Midway. The battle's true lessons were about the importance of intelligence, timing, aggressive action, and the courage of pilots who pressed attacks despite overwhelming odds. The numbers tell the essential story. Before Midway, Japan had never lost a carrier in combat. In one day, they lost 4. American carrier aviation, which had seemed overmatched by superior Japanese aircraft and pilots, had achieved decisive victory through a combination of intelligence, courage, determination, and yes, some fortunate accidents of timing and approach. On June 4, 1942, American dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet at the perfect moment, not because of brilliant tactical innovation, but because of determination to find and attack the enemy despite navigation errors, communication failures, and dwindling fuel. Their scattered approaches, born of necessity rather than design, complicated Japanese defense at a critical moment when carriers were vulnerable. The victory came not from discovering a new principle of warfare, but from aggressive execution of an imperfect attack at an opportune moment. 3 Japanese carriers burned not because chaos defeated order, but because American pilots found them rearming and refueling, pressed their attacks despite disorganization, and put bombs on target when it mattered most. June 4, 1942. 10:28 hours. The tide of the Pacific War turned in 6 minutes. not through tactical genius or revolutionary doctrine, but through determination, courage, and the fortunate convergence of multiple factors, including the accidental dispersion of attacking aircraft, that created an opportunity seized by brave men in obsolescent aircraft. The lesson wasn't that disorder defeats order, but that in war, aggressive imperfection often succeeds where perfect preparation might fail. That truth, demonstrated in the waters off Midway, would influence American naval aviation for the remainder of the war and beyond.